I believe, to forewarn you that from here on out I am now recording. In terms of our agenda for today, just to remind you, two items I was particularly keen to cover. First was to talk about the sort of European resolver policy for resolver operators and others, which I'll come on to in a moment. And then to pick up on a query that I received last week, is really to take your views on a testing regime for encrypted DNS deployments. I've sort of swapped emails with a few people about that over the last few days and had a few inputs, so thank you for those that were able to share them. But I thought it might be constructive just to have a discussion on that as well, and see what people thought, and then we'll move on to any other business if there are other things that people would like to bring up. So let me firstly just open up my slide sharing. If I can work out where the relevant slide is, bear with me. Right, so I'm hoping that on your screens, you should be able to see a slide. Tell me if that's not the case, but hopefully there should be. It's not a very inspiring slide, to be fair, to begin with. It's just the title slide. So this is really, as the title says, to talk about a resolver policy document that's suitable for Europe.
Andrew?
Yes.
One sec. One comment. The thing that's being shown on Zoom is the speaker's view, not the main presentation view.
Ah, that's not ideal because that's harder for you to see. Thank you. Let me see if I can fix that.
Let's find out.
You're probably going to have to present it as yourself, I would think, as it were.
Yeah. Tell you what,
yeah, switch screen off is also the thing you want to do.
Or if you've got two screens, you can swap them around.
Yeah, it's not letting me.
Yeah, those are the two specialists.
Yeah.
Let me just try again.
Yeah, they were also the ones that we were considering.
The first version was more readable than the second one, as it were.
Right. Okay.
So if you just stick with the sort of editing view, as it were, rather than a presentation view almost.
Okay, let me go back to that then.
If that works for you.
Yeah. Okay, can you see that again then?
Yeah, yeah. That's
right.
fine.
Let me see if I can.
I'm on an iPad, and actually, this view is totally readable, Andrew.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, fine. Let's go with this then, and I'll worry about why that doesn't work at another time. Okay, so as you can see, the issues, as I see them, are that looking at many of the current policies in various documents, they're either client software specific, resolver operator specific, or indeed ISP specific. Some of them don't take into account facilities. I've used examples of malware filtering and other types of malicious content. You can think of other examples of items which aren't currently catered for. Some don't encourage the sharing of anonymized cyber intelligence information, and probably most importantly from a European context, some aren't really appropriate for European users in that they don't explicitly take into account legislation such as GDPR, and some of the other legislation, which is common across most European markets. Now, this is going to be harder to see, not in screen view. I will enlarge it as far as I can. Okay, I'll call out the key points. Is probably best on here. So what we've looked at is to work through, firstly, some of the key privacy requirements that should be in a resolver policy that's sort of fit for purpose for the European marketplace. I'm not going to go through these word by word, line by line, because you can read them quicker than I can say them. But you'll see, for example, that we specify that resolver operators shouldn't retain, sell or transfer to any third party any data, including personal information, IP addresses or other user or device identifiers or user query patterns. Caveat on that is, unless required to do so by law or education, or law or regulation even, and with the informed consent of users. The resolver operator shouldn't seek to monetize the data, which we specified in the footnote at the bottom of the page, and shouldn't use cookies other than DNS cookies. Should support relevant internet standards to protect privacy and to ensure the validity of its responses. May, in some circumstances, direct the user to alternative content, but needs to document those circumstances if it does so.
Can I interject with the cookie thing?
Yes.
Because if you are using DOE, you don't need DNS cookies. DNS cookies are really there to protect against potential UDP attack surface. Somebody who sends DNS cookies over a DOH connection, which already has kind of like the TCP SYN cookies protection, is making something not very bright. So maybe just delete the cookie thing from the, I mean, the DNS cookies are not needed.
Yeah, so what I should have said at the start, Ralph, so apologies, is this isn't intended to be specific to DOE, although it can be. This could apply to any type of resolver operator.
Okay.
But so you're right, and I should have said that to make that clear. So my apologies.
Okay. No problem.
For not adding that at the start. You found me out. So yeah. Yeah, so this is intended not just be for DOE, could apply to DOT, or indeed for classic DNS, and in due course DNS over QUIC, etc. That is the intent, that it's not protocol specific. I mean, again, you can read the detail of this far more quickly than I can say it, or at least I hope you can if the text is legible on your devices. And then the final point is that if the operator is chosen to run a closed resolver, it should say so, just so that is clearly stated in its privacy policy. In terms of security and privacy requirements, and the font is a bit bigger here, so this will be a little easier for you to read. Clearly, we recommend that resolver operators incorporate tools to protect users and networks from needless exposure to malicious content. And it should state what the malware protection, if any, is provided. they obviously must comply with legal requirements and best practices for obvious reasons. And again, you can sort of see the details of that. They may support filtering options, which might include, for example, parental controls and other such filtering. And should share anonymized cyber intelligence information with appropriate stakeholders. Some examples given there. And Joey, answering the question on chat, which I belatedly saw, the intent of this policy is to provide an alternative policy document that resolver operators could use to actually have a sort of consistent approach to the issues that we're covering.
So, hi Andrew. I had a quick question related to this. Is best practices and some of the similar wording in this document, best practices always seem to me to be in the eye of the beholder, right? Yeah. And I suppose that people could argue that any behaviour could be claimed to be a best practice to somebody, right? So I think that perhaps needs to be tightened up a bit as to what is really meant there and what's a best practice and what isn't a best practice.
Yeah, industry norms might be a better choice of phrase to use, I think.
Yeah, and obviously in the actual sort of text document, as opposed to the bits I've extracted onto the slide, there are footnotes against many of these points. Off the top of my head, Ian, I can't remember if there are some specifics on that one, but your point is well made if we haven't covered that currently in the footnotes. But in various of these elements, there are more details, which it just wasn't sufficient room to get them all on the slide, and I didn't think it would work well to try and put the Word document on the screen. I thought that'd be even less legible. But yeah, as I say, you're right, though, in principle that sort of details are needed against these points.
Andrew, this is Zaid. I have a question regarding the first point. Regarding tools, shouldn't users have or providers have tools available for the users to confirm their compliance with the agreement, or should this just be, because currently, to my understanding, it's a statement that you sign off on when you prescribe to the service, and you never really have the option to go check exactly whether that particular claimed statement is there's no way to verify it from a user perspective. Should the tools include tools to users to verify these things?
Well, sorry, should they include tools to verify that they do have protection? Is that?
Well, to verify that the provider is complying with whatever they're claiming they're complying with. So, for example, I'm a provider and I'm not going to contain your data. So I have to have tools available for you to make sure that I'm not keeping your data.
Yeah. It might be better just to delete the words to incorporate tools and just say resolve records are strongly recommended to protect users and networks. Blah, blah, blah.
Sure. Mine is blah, blah, blah.
Can you hold that point for the moment, Zaid?
Not a problem. Not a problem. Yeah, I'll hold it. No problem.
But yeah. Any other questions or observations on these points before I move on? Answers no. And then perhaps more importantly, so that brings us on to then transparency requirements. So there should be a publicly available privacy notice that's available to the users and in due course to client software, either as a standalone privacy notice or if the resolver operator does other stuff. It could be a section within a wider sort of a privacy notice. It could be a section within that. It should confirm that it is operating in a manner which is compliant with the relevant legislation, the examples of which are given there. Set out what user identifiable data is collected, and where any such data is shared with third parties to facilitate the operation of the resolver, if at all. Summarize what categories of data are retained and for what period of time, and whether or not they're anonymized.
Can I just interject there, Andrew?
Of course, Jim.
Would there be an issue here with the EU's Data Retention Directive?
In what sense, Jim?
In the sense of what data is are being retained and for what purpose?
Would that be saying, would that be an issue with the Data Protection Directive?
Well, it's not a data protection issue, it's the Data Retention Directive.
Oh, sorry, I misheard what you said. Data retention, did you say?
Yes.
Right, apologies. I thought you were querying whether that was consistent with data protection. In what respect, Jim?
Well, as I understand it correctly, large operators are required to comply with that directive and store certain data for certain periods of time. And I don't know, maybe it is the case, maybe it's not the case, that DNS query data falls within the scope of the directive or not. Maybe
Oh, I
that's
see.
a local matter.
Right, sorry, I'm with you. Okay, so again, on the footnotes, which I haven't put on the slide for legibility reasons, the intent or the caveat there is if they're required to do so, unless they're required to do so by relevant legislation. So clearly, if a resolver operator is required to retain data, then it will have to comply with the legislation, but it should state that it's doing that. So this is all about transparency. This is not about saying what you shouldn't do things necessarily, but you should at least be clear that you're doing them. So
I presume if the law says you're not allowed to say anything, that's also valid.
Oh, that's true as well, I suppose. Yes, fair point.
So, such things do exist.
You're a bad man.
No, they don't.
I don't write the laws. I just have to comply with them.
No, you missed the point. They don't exist. That's official.
Who's got the black helicopter?
Okay, I think we covered the last point. It's about malicious content.
Andrew, one point on transparency, which I think is really good. You know, when we get into cross-border situations and cross-jurisdictional situations, it can get very confusing to people to understand what a particular site or service is complying with. On your previous slide, where you said that they need to state, you know, that they are compliant with, maybe a flip way of, and not flippant, but flip way of looking at that is to actually have them state what legislation and other requirements they are compliant with.
Yes, I mean, given an example here, which happens to be UK examples, but that could equally be, if it's operating a service for German users, it could well be the sort of relevant German legislation, national as opposed to just the European.
Exactly. I guess my point is I sometimes read these things when some lawyers who maybe are lazy or try to be clever write them, and they often will use phrases like, you know, we're compliant with all the required legislation. Well, you haven't told me what legislation you have decided is required in your statement. So
yeah,
small looking at the exact same statement you put there.
I guess in practice it might be hard to list all the relevant legislation, but you might have a stab at saying what jurisdiction you're under.
Which will be a good start.
Yes.
Yes.
Because I guess in the States, the equivalent will be which state, at the very least, you're operating in, Glenn. Would that be fair?
In the States right now, the landscape is actually pretty easy because basically if you're compliant with the California one, which is the leading privacy statement out there, nobody else has really done much yet either. Down the road, it may become a 50 plus federal different ways of looking at it. But right now, it's pretty much if you're compliant with California, you're good to go.
Okay.
But I will also say that's my understanding. I am not a privacy expert or a lawyer in real life.
We won't hold.
And frankly, there's not a lot of case law or precedent right now, and that's going to get very, very complicated as soon as the first cases hit the courts because of the fact that the internet doesn't necessarily follow state or national boundaries.
Yeah, the lawyers will make a lot of money on this one for a long time to come, as usual.
Yeah.
And sorry to take this point on for more than a few more moments, but the jurisdictional question is one of critical importance to this document because of the way that traffic moves and the way that people connect to different services. Understanding what the jurisdiction is and what laws you are under is very important. And the GDPR, of course, offers a guideline, but it still varies nation to nation with extensions, and especially with things like child protection or content filtering. That's wildly varying in different places. So even a single provider, an ISP, who operates in a multinational footprint can be pointing users from nation A into locations in nation B. Recursive operators that have anycast arrays, like myself, which is why I'm asking this, that jurisdictional question becomes one of that's really what this whole document starts to boil down to, is how do you deal with users who are moving from place to place and changing jurisdiction due to the way the network is configured, and how do you understand who they are, and how do you present the right version of this document or the right implementation of a privacy policy to those users based on their jurisdiction.
Yeah, because in a sense, John, it's relatively straightforward to provide a form of words in a privacy document. The tough thing is providing the right content from your resolver in multiple countries.
Correct.
Because I'm confident I could write a form of words which covers that eventuality, but how you serve the data is far harder.
Sure.
Well, as John brings up, there is the question that when under the covers, the network protocols themselves are pushing users across borders, whether it's Anycast or if it's more active load balancing going on that's actually direct to users, or even over failovers when you have faults in the system. So it does seem to get quite complicated when you start crossing borders between users and resolvers and the provider, especially from a multinational provider.
Yeah, which I guess a lot of the ISPs, which are country specific, won't have that issue, but operations like John's absolutely do, where they're operating across borders.
And frankly, I mean, that restricting it just to national-based operators is there are quite a few of those, of course, but most even national-based operators have now legs in other countries. Everyone's trying to get into an international model to extend their reach. So jurisdiction questions, I think, is really what I guess I'm coming down to. It is really difficult how to present that, how to create these transparency requirements if we are talking about presenting the jurisdictional level laws. Like, in other words, what law are you under? How do you do that? The GDPR is a good start, but it isn't actually those actually don't define the laws that you're complying with.
No, well, and also GDPR is fine, and there will be implementations of that across the various member states, but many of them also have separate national legislation covering different things entirely. Such as Ralph, I think it's in Germany at the moment, there's specific legislation in Germany about the removal of certain types of content, for example. and that will vary around the different member states accordingly.
And without floating too many rumours in the UK, we're obviously going to be trying to sit in the middle to some extent, because we're going to be trying to sort of satisfy all the parties with whom we're trying to trade.
Yes, indeed. I was deliberately not using the UK as an example
Yes.
for all sorts of reasons, Simon.
Yes.
Okay, let me just finish the run through as I was just starting to touch on this. These last few points on transparency state what categories of illegal content are blocked. Where appropriate, if filtering tools are offered, give sort of details of what those are, and importantly, for content providers, have an appeals process if people believe that their content has been blocked incorrectly because perhaps it's been wrongly categorized, for example. State whether and in what circumstances users will be directed to alternative content. I've given the example of addressing customer service issues. There will no doubt be other examples, and it's important to be clear when that would happen. So it's transparent. And in non-technical terms, as far as is practical, sort of explain the technical and operational choices that the operator has made to protect the privacy of its users. Just going back to one of the earlier comments. So given that you can't be sort of prescriptive in all this, at least set out what choices have been made to do that. And then final 2 points, what we haven't put in the document at the moment is any specific technical and operational requirements, in the expectation that in due course there may well be a BCP coming out of the ADD working group. So at which point it may well be appropriate to refer out to the BCP for that detail. And then finally, at the moment, we haven't specified the auditing policy. Again, that's to be done. But if you like, the bones of the document are the bits I've covered off around the privacy and transparency and security requirements. So does that prompt any other questions or observations from anyone?
One comment, Andrew, you were talking about the appeals process for content
Yes.
providers. Surely the appeals process might also be required for the end user.
Because
I want to
they
get to a
believe
service.
something's being improperly blocked.
Oh, I see. Right. Yes. Yes. Fair comment.
I realise operators won't like that because they're going to be getting lots more calls to the help desks and customer support lines. And I'm wondering if that should be part of this certification policy thing too.
Any of the companies that currently offer operate an appeals process, are you able to say off the top of your heads whether that generally applies just to the content operators or users or both?
It's usually the users.
It's usually the users.
Okay.
If the content people want to do it, they get sent to the block. They get sent to the block list provider.
Yeah.
So just to add some more complexity to this, the appeals process varies depending on what it is you are appealing to have unblocked. If you are talking about a legal issue, a category of content that is disallowed by law, then the appeals process should not be in the hands of the provider. That needs to be probably in the hands of the law organization who has classified that content.
Yeah.
Or is it? Or, you know, who actually creates these classifications? Under what circumstances? I don't think we have a clear definition of that, or do we?
So we're taking that point then, John, on the appeals process where it's illegal content or apparently illegal content, then ordinarily that will be a reference back to the courts, because typically, certainly in the UK, a lot of that content will be blocked. I'm thinking of copyright infringements, for example. That'll be blocked on the back of a court order. So the appeals process is not with the resolver operator. They're simply complying with a court order. So that in that example, you'd have to go back to the courts to challenge that, as opposed to if it's filtering, then that would typically be either to the resolver operator or more likely to the person that's providing them with their block lists or sort of filtering lists.
Even though that might fall into a legally restricted category?
No, what are you thinking of as an example?
A site that has sexually explicit material that it's questionable whether the content is illegal or legal in the country. Who's the arbiter of that?
Again, that will probably vary by country. I think in the UK, ultimately, that would be the police and the Crown Prosecution Service that make that.
I think the bigger point John is making there is perhaps this appeals process needs to be independent, both of the operator and the provider of the service.
Yeah, as an operator, I'm not, if you're exposing me to legal action based on what I do or do not filter, suddenly that's a hot potato, right? I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. Somebody else needs to tell me what I can and cannot include in this list. And this gets back to my original comments way back when on this document, which is like, wow, legal content is an extraordinarily difficult, or, you know, subjective filtering on content is extraordinarily difficult. And if we start to attach legal requirements to subjective filtering done by the provider, this is kind of going to be a spanner in the works. I mean, it's going to really break things as far as anybody wanting to comply with this document.
Well, remember,
this is where I would suggest we have a bit of a jurisdictional problem. So, for example, in the UK, we would want any operator to apply the level of filtering that is generally understood or provided for any operator operating within the UK under UK law. Now, if of course the actual filtering takes place outside UK jurisdiction, that becomes an issue, because the process is subject to the jurisdiction of another territory, but we in the UK, seeing the other end, want UK law to be applied. So I think, you know, we've got a bit of a technical, operational, legal issue, but I think any jurisdiction that is putting some sort of legal requirement will have a clear expression of it, but we have an issue as to where it actually takes place, etc.
Yeah, and I find this particularly amusing because I literally came right into this call after debugging a problem of why all of our BT traffic is going to Madrid.
The answer is easy. It's lovely there this time of year.
It's warmer.
True. But
although we're subject to 14-day quarantine when it comes back again.
you're subject to 35 millisecond quarantine as well, whatever. But this is correct. I mean, these jurisdictional questions are really, really tough, and you're going to have a lot of people who are reticent to sign off on this policy when they start to think about how that affects their business.
Except of course, whether it's, I mean, the legal bit as opposed to optional filtering, whether they have it in a policy or not, it's something they're still subject to. They might not realize it, but it still applies.
Oh yeah, yeah. but does it? Depending on where the traffic ends, it doesn't.
And it's still here.
Well, I mean, that's actually so. Let me give you some counter arguments here, because I've ran DNS for a European-wide provider 10 years ago, and there were different kind of country jurisdictions that we all had to comply with. And the way we, differentiate them was very easy, because by IP address. And when you think about that, pretty much all of these services doing music or video content can do filtering by IP and then not allow you to that. I mean, that's an easy thing to do from a technical perspective. The implementing of the data retention is much harder. But again, technically this might be hard, but doable. The question is, I understand that how do you get the information, what to block and what's not? That is probably really the hard bit. And one would hope that unless you are trialed, you can get away with it. But it is certainly possible to do that.
I think Till was trying to come in as well there. I think I heard Till's voice. He may have changed his mind.
No, just technical issues on my side.
Oh, okay.
No, it's just one comment, because I looked at something from a policy perspective, so not technical policy, purely in terms of writing the stuff around defamation about 7 years ago or so, where we sort of looked, in a way, had similar trouble. And I think my basic point is, I think at the moment, the document as it is either too detailed or it doesn't have enough detail. So it suggests that there should be an appeals process, that there should be data provided, that there are rights associated with all of this stuff around blocking, without actually spelling out those rights. And that might be the trigger point for a lot of people on this call, and also for other companies that might look at this, that this doesn't really require them to do a lot of things, but it hints at you need an appeals process. You need to be sure about what you block, what you don't block, and that then might make it potentially quite tricky for these companies to sign up. So I think to solve this, you would probably either, in my opinion, either provide a lot more detail about what this all entails, or you go back to sort of more basic principles around what companies should be doing around blocking and filtering and how they deal with content, and then sort of in a way leave it up to them to ensure compliance with the law. I don't know whether that makes sense, but I think at the moment it's somewhere in the middle between telling people what to do and not really telling people what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and I wonder whether anything in this sentence is really helpful, if I'm brutally honest.
Ooh, which one? The one that I happen to have highlighted, which is...
Yes, yeah. The first point, why would you say it? And the second point, yeah, how do you understand it?
Okay, because I know on this appeals process for optional filtering, many companies that I'm familiar with do provide that.
Okay, and I was specifically looking at the one that you had highlighted on screen.
Okay, right. Okay, so you're thinking of the first one. So you think on reflection, Ian, it'd be better not to say that.
Well, and also just shall not disclose details that would be helpful to those seeking to access the block content. Well, yeah, it probably shouldn't, but do we need to say that? And what would you interpret that to mean if you were the reader? I'm not sure.
I would remind you, without being, without pointing fingers too much, but one of the original policy documents in this space initially required people to publish the details of all of the sites that were blocked.
Yeah, I understand. This is probably a response to that statement, but equally, is it the right way to respond to that? I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, on that point, unless anybody's got any other observations, I was intending to send to you after the call a copy of the draft as it currently stands for your perusal, and this will be the Word document, not the slides, which includes the footnotes. So give people an opportunity to actually read through and reflect, and then come back with your thoughts on a more considered basis to add to those comments that you've already made. So can I just ask, does anyone else have any sort of points they particularly want to?
Yes, I've got 200.
Go on then, Jim, fire away.
First one is, and some of these things, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with use of musts, and maybe should might be more appropriate. Certainly using IETF must in capital letters. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the right thing to do. Say, for example, must not disclose details that would be helpful to those seeking to access the block content. There may be circumstances where it would be helpful to disclose those details in order to resolve some other kind of problem. So maybe saying must not is perhaps a bit too prescriptive in certain circumstances. I don't know. My second consideration is something we haven't really talked about in this particular call and haven't really talked about in the context of TRR policies, but maybe we need to think about what do we do for TRRs inside enterprises? Are we only concerned about public networks?
Oh, okay. So you think about for the purpose of employees?
Yes.
Right. Most of the ones I've seen there typically say you work with the policies that we, your employer, decide. They say it in more words than that, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah, exactly. In that case, all the stuff we're talking about, you know, appeals mechanisms and able to find out what kind of filtering mechanisms are in place and all the rest of it is somewhat moot.
Yes, yeah, this is very much for public resolvers as opposed to those provided by enterprises for their employees.
Fair enough. But I do think this is maybe something that perhaps we have to think about, maybe not for this document, maybe there has to be a separate one, which is this is what applies. These are sort of things that could form part of a TRR policy inside an enterprise.
Yeah, okay, that's a fair point. Right, and any last comments before we move on from anyone? No? Okay, thank you. As I say, I will share with you, some of you will have seen this already, but I'll share with you, those of you that haven't, the document for your perusal and comment. So thank you for that. If we just move on swiftly, as I mentioned at the start, this is something that came up on an email last week, which is a request for help on a testing regime for encrypted DNS resolvers, and really whether anyone has a documented testing regime that they're able to share. And perhaps more broadly, and Glenn may wish to respond to this, whether it will be useful to have a more sort of standardized, dare I say, sort of testing regime, which perhaps could be lodged on EDI somewhere, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly, you know, put it there. If people think there's a need for it, I mean, you know, we got a few people doing their things here, a few people doing things there. If there's some consistency, certainly.
But testing what, Andrew? What's the scope of the test that you're mentioning?
Okay, so this was in response to a query. So for someone that's looking to start deploying a DO resolver, for example, whether there's a sort of standardized sort of testing script, simplistically, that they could use to give them comfort that what they've deployed is actually working correctly.
Okay. So there's of course there's a policy test, right? And then there's the technical. Do you apply? You know, do the current standards apply, and are they working correctly? Those are sort of different things. And that's why I was asking.
More the operational side, not the policy side in this instance,
okay.
John, for clarity.
Well, they do sometimes intersect, right? are you leaking data? Are you doing appropriate padding? Those kind of things, which actually do speak to the policy components of privacy.
Fair point.
I mean, Andrew, it seems like if somebody wanted to sort of start writing that up, you know, if somebody wants to jump in, that could be the start of a sort of a best practices document, and certainly could host it and publish it through Eddie, no problem there.
Okay.
But I mean, you know, especially stuff that focuses on the you know, operational stuff, like is scaling working? What's your load capacity? You know, are things turned on properly? And I get it, because, you know, as a lot of smaller entities are looking to deploy this, that you maybe don't have a large DNS team that has been able to keep on top of all this in the past year and a half, and they're starting to go, well, gosh, I want to do this. How do I do this? Is the next question a lot of them are starting to have.
Well, when you consider, I guess, that by far the majority of resolver operators have yet to dip their toe into encrypted DNS of either flavor. So there's a whole bunch of people that I guess have got a learning curve to go up. So this could be helpful to them potentially. But okay, I'll put a note within the notes to that effect, to see what appetite there is for people to share what they've done, those that have deployed already, to see whether that could form the basis for some sort of useful best practice in this space. And on that note, that brings us on to any other business. So does anyone have anything else that they would like to cover?
Yeah, Andrew Glenn here. I had one idea which I wanted to float up to everybody to see if anybody thought it was useful, and if anybody had any insight on how to do it. You know, I was looking at one of these beautiful sites that showed the COVID you know, numbers globally and even locally in jurisdictions. And it struck me that it would be really interesting to see something like that for DOE availability, where you could sort of look over, you know, like I could look at North America, and I could see, like, you know, where in North America DOE was deployed by operators. I equally could see where DOE was, you know, turned on for various browsers. Or I could look in Europe and see, like, well, you know, has Mozilla turned it on in Switzerland? I don't know if all the data is available. I'm not a graphics person, so I don't want to do the fancy map. But clearly these things have been done before, so there's examples. Is that something useful, people think? You know, if we found somebody who could work on that, I don't know, maybe like, is that like an internet society? Would they have the skills? I don't know, maybe somebody has it out there. What do people think?
So I was going to. So this is it. I had a question actually that just falls into the same scope that Glenn mentioned, and that is, where can we get latest DOE statistics? But yeah, so just wanted to answer that.
Well, APNIC potentially a good place for DOE statistics, if you mean in terms of the percentage traffic that's running on DOE, that sort of thing. Zaid?
How would anybody have any statistics on DOE other than?
Yeah, that's what I meant. But yeah, I looked at APNIC. I couldn't find anything specific to DOE. There are providers, but it's not.
Yeah, but for APNIC it would be hard, because all they can do is really issue an URL lookup, and I don't know how you can find out if that was served by DOE or regular DNS. You can find out the DNS provider, but that doesn't tell you if it's DOE or. So if you want to do something, you probably have to do something browser plugin if you do it from the client end. And that's not a good thing, I guess.
I think Jeff Houston might be able to get some sort of data about that through those URL lookups that he generates through the ad network. He does for all his measurement stuff. But what I think you're probably finding there is measuring the exit points whenever the DOE traffic leaves, for example, an anycast provider like Quad9. I'm pretty certain Jeff will be able to gather that stuff. But as for other deployments of DO. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, but even Cloud9. I mean, how do you know the traffic came over DO or dot or
tell.
regular DNS? You can't tell.
Yeah, there's no the only we're in a kind of a honeymoon period right now where the only big DO deployments are in the large cloud centralized DNS recursive arrays, and that's great because with just a few people answering the question, we could tell you what's going on with DO at the moment. That's going to change very quickly. The other people who could tell you are the browser operators because they're the only ones really deploying DO at scale so far. But when Windows comes along, that's also going to change the equation. So I don't know if other than kind of general update reports from Cloudflare and Quad9 and NextDNS and some others, I don't know if there's going to be that data is not going to be very useful for very long.
John, do you think the browser vendors will actually have that data? I mean, I understand, for example, if they're using Quad9, your service is completely anonymized. So how can...
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know if so. As an example, I'm sorry that I'm unfamiliar with how people like Mozilla capture whether a TRR is being used or not in any of their telemetry. I know that there is some telemetry that comes back from Mozilla, which gives some basic data about what the browser is doing. Maybe there's a flag in there that says TRR is set to 1 or not. Right. I honestly don't know, and I don't know how Chrome if they do any of that at all either. So those would be the only two places right now where I could see it being trackable. And but as Ralph says, it's going to quickly disappear.
Trackable on the server side. So you guys and whoever runs a DO resolver farm can tell you my traffic is 99% or 90% regular, 10% DO, whatever. So I mean, and I would hope that once we get to more DO deployments, when ISPs do deploy that stuff, that they also give such reports on their deployments. What is the kind of uptake of that stuff?
Yep. But I don't know if there's any. I don't think there's any way to test that other than asking the people who operate DO resolvers directly. I don't know if there's any way to just have that be visible. Although that is an interesting point. It might be the case that we could ask someone like Jeff to create a special host name that we as resolver operators would say, all right, if the request came in on DO, we're going to for the special zone, or even that we're going to send it to this we're going to rewrite the host name and send it to here versus somewhere else. Maybe that could be a canary that we could all agree on. So that's something to maybe talk about with Jeff.
Yeah, that sounds like an interesting idea.
Does that help at all, Glenn? Sounds like it's more complicated.
Yeah, it always is more complicated than you hope. I mean, it's a start. What I'm really hearing is I don't think we have the data unless people start volunteering to publish it. Which is, not surprising.
We're happy to publish our percentages. That's something we're happy to do. But again, that's you might not get the same cooperation from everybody who's running a DO server, and that's the number of people operating DO servers hopefully is going to go up dramatically. And so I don't know how long those kind of volunteer data will be useful on a global scale.
That's true.
Just a couple of points, Glenn. Maybe worth asking Jeff to see what insights he has on this, and possibly Casey Caffey at CADA, because I would imagine CADA might be doing some measurements of this kind of thing. I'm surprised if they weren't.
Interesting, Jim. Yeah, maybe. Anyways, good job, gentlemen.
Glenn, I'll definitely volunteer to build your map and the website, but you need to find the data from somewhere. I don't know how to get the data.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's the tricky part is the data. Yeah, let me chew on this a bit. It may die in the vine, but it was an idea.
The more I'm thinking about it, the more there's.
For another call, so I'll talk to you all next week.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Glenn.
The more I think about it, the more merit there is to some kind of canary domain that asks for different things, whether the request came in on DO or dot or something else. I think most of the big recursive operators have the ability to rewrite So that would be an interesting method, although there might be some objections to that as well because it's revealing something about the end users, but not in quantity, not in bulk, I guess.
No. No, because you could easily separate out the source for IP address, couldn't you, for that sort of thing? You're just looking at volumes in some way. Okay, any points anyone else wants to bring up just in the last minute or so? I'll take that as a no, in which case I'll just remind you that Eurodig runs later this week. If you want to attend, it's free to attend, but you need to have registered by tomorrow. I'll send a reminder with the URL for anyone that doesn't have that to hand. And amongst other things, there is a discussion on encrypted DNS on Thursday, if you're interested on that. And also on Wednesday this week, there's the next meeting of the European Commission's high-level Internet Governance Group, which again, you can attend the morning of that session, obviously virtually, but you need to register for that, I think, by tomorrow. And again, I'll put the a link with the notes, primarily because there's going to be at least a brief discussion on DOE again in that session, just for your information. I think Vittorio from Open Exchange is giving a brief information update, and there may well be discussion afterwards amongst the attendees. Okay, but on that note, we're just on the hour, so thanks everyone for your time, and enjoy the rest of the week. Speak next week.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Andrew.